Hi, this is John Romano, and I'm recording a lecture, Conflict in the Muslim World, from my course, World Civilization to 1500. In this lecture, we're going to be discussing the period from around the year 1000 to around the year 1450, which was a time of particular unrest in the Muslim world. When the last time we spoke about the Muslim world, we had said that the Muslims had created an enormous empire known as a caliphate that spanned much of North Africa and throughout the Middle East. What we're going to see, however, starting in around the 10th century, is an age of decline and disintegration for the caliphate. And you can get some idea of this from just looking at this map that I have here. Islam as a political unity is going to begin to splinter, and a series of semi-autonomous states will begin to grow up at this time. Something referred to as a caliphate still exists, but it no longer has the same sort of enormous power as the old caliphate once did. Instead, what we're going to see is a group of semi-autonomous states beginning to grow up, which only in theory respond to the caliph, and in fact are more or less independent. In some cases, we're going to see even stranger instances of radical groups, splinter groups, begin to grow up. One of the most interesting of these, and one that has always been a subject of fascination for modern observers, are a group known as the Assassins. The Assassins were a radical Muslim group who grew up especially finding bases in mountainous areas throughout the Middle East. This is just one example of the kind of bases that they would set up for their operatives. The Assassins, as the name would indicate, their main means of changing the world, of engaging in politics, if you will, was to assassinate any leaders who went against the rather uncompromising vision of Islam that they had. And in some sense, they were equal opportunity killers. They would kill any foreign leaders, any non-Muslim leaders, but also any Muslim leaders that they thought deviated from their particular religious vision. The name assassin comes from the drug hashish, and it was rumored that some of their foot soldiers, or those who would be expected to go lead essentially what are suicide missions against some of their enemies, that they would be given this drug, and the drug would be taken away from them unless they agreed to go ahead and do one of these missions. Into the vacuum of the Muslim world that was created by this new political situation came a new people that burst into the scene. These were people known as the Turks. The Turks initially came from Central Asia, but as this map indicates, they ended up in time creating an absolutely enormous empire in the 11th century. And this in part included the Middle East, and while they were ruling in this area, in time they would actually end up converting to Islam. Although the Turks took over an enormous amount of territory, most historians tend to think that their empire was really a very loose one. They really had very little interest in anything like political administration. In essence, they saw this empire as one in which they could take a huge amount of tribute money from subject peoples. And they never even really bothered to create a very strong political structure for themselves. In essence, the Turks were able to sustain themselves by their military might in this territory. Now, although the leaders now of much of the Muslim world no longer provided the same sort of guidance spiritually that caliphs traditionally were said to have to offer their people. One should not think that Islam ceased to be important in these territories. And we can see this in the sort of new creation of a position of leadership in the Muslim world this time. A group of notable people who are referred to as the ulama become very important during this time period. The ulama were not political leaders, but they were teachers, they were religious leaders, they were people who were very knowledgeable in the Quran and Muslim law. And we think that really the ulama, in some sense, were the ones who took over positions of authority and gave people guidance, gave them judgment in some cases, so that the Muslim world could continue to function, even without having the same sort of religious guidance that once they depended upon, coming from caliphs, for instance. And we think people like the ulama really helped to keep social unity throughout the Muslim world. We think ultimately, though, that the Turks their numbers were relatively few in contrast to the number of subject peoples in their new empire. And we think that for obvious reasons, they never gained much loyalty to many of their subjects. Because in essence, they were their power came from military might and nothing more. Some people also tend to think that Turks helped to create a situation of destabilization for Muslim territories at this time. Like many late converts, we think that Turks, as they begin to convert to Islam, tended to be fairly intolerant to adherents of other religions. And again, this is really flies in the face of the traditional tolerance for which Muslims were noted. The fact that they had maintained for centuries large minority communities of Christians and Jews in territories that were a majority Muslim. This would be trouble both for Christians who lived within the Turkish regions, the regions dominated by Turks, but also for pilgrims who came from elsewhere, from Christian pilgrims, and especially some of those Christian pilgrims who wished to go see some of the most famous sites of Christianity. I'm showing here a picture of the Holy Sepulchre, for instance, in Jerusalem, the church that, among the other things that it commemorates, is the spot in which Jesus was laid before he was resurrected. The Turks began to attack not only Muslims, but they also began to make significant progress into the Byzantine Empire, and especially Asia Minor, the territory that is modern-day Turkey. And in effect, some of these victories the Turks had over the Byzantines were so devastating and caused such great loss of some of the military of the Byzantine Empire that the Byzantine rulers at this time felt that they had no choice but to turn to Western Europe for help. Now, this may appear to be a strange decision, given what we've seen, that the Byzantines were not on good terms with Western Europeans. But at this time, first of all, they were desperate, and second, one could say that they were still Christian brothers, even if there was the schism that religiously held between the two of them. They still represented the same faith. And this is why the Byzantines decided to send emissaries to the Pope, whose picture I'm showing here, a man by the name of Urban II. Even if you know a lot about popes, you may never have heard about Urban II, which in some sense is strange because he, more than anyone else, was the creator of this entire new kind of expedition, this new campaign known as the Crusades. A movement that, as we'll see, really became enormously popular in Western Europe. Urban II received some of these emissaries for the Byzantine world who really had very concrete demands. What the Byzantine emperor wanted from Western Europe was a body of knights to aid him in battle, to immediately take the field. And the reason he came to the Pope was because he was as close to a UN, or sort of an international body that existed in Western Europe at the time. It is fair to say that Urban II had a very different idea of what this campaign could be. Not just a campaign to help the Byzantines, but one primarily to recover some of the holy places of the faith, such as Jerusalem itself, especially at a time in which it was more difficult to travel there because of the presence of the Turks. And in this regard, Urban II is really taking part in this model of piety at the time that said that it was important to actually go to the places where Jesus himself had walked, had done his miracles. And people were very excited about that at that time. And for that reason, Urban II gave a stirring speech at this council in the middle of France that really all of a sudden got all kinds of people very excited for this new kind of holy war, a war for the purposes of the faith, to take back some of the great sites of Christianity in the Middle East. And in fact, the first people who ended up going on this campaign were nothing like the Byzantines had wanted. These were people who, in many cases, were peasants who really had no ability to fight. And so even before any really official crusade body had gotten together, they ended up crossing over to some of the territories where the Turks were, and they were promptly slaughtered. So you can see in this picture, they're shown in white because they're meant to be martyrs. After this initial sort of a very failed attempt to do anything in the Muslim world, then a series of nobles got together and created a far more regimented army that would then go and cross over into the Middle East. Although these men, these crusaders, had no idea of it, they had actually chosen a fantastic time to fight in the Muslim world. Because of the conditions we discussed earlier, the lack of unity among Muslim fighters meant that these crusaders were able to take a lot of territory. And there was no one unified response by a large Muslim army at once. And we think that these crusaders very quickly got the ideas of how to make the best of using, for instance, their swords and lances against the arrows of the Turks. They learned how to maneuver in the desert, for instance. And they were able then to conquer a series of cities and fend off the counterattack of their Muslim adversaries. They finally reached the holy city of Jerusalem. They laid siege to it. They surrounded it with their armies, and then they were able to enter the city, at which point they decided to give over the city to a frightful massacre of its inhabitants. Some of the crusade accounts talk about a stream of blood flowing through the city of Jerusalem at the time, which may have been something of an exaggeration, but still a lot of people were killed in this process. And you can see here just one sign of the Crusaders having taken the city of Jerusalem. These were crosses that were put up by early Crusaders in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. At this point, the Western Europeans ended up naming one of the Crusaders as a new king in Jerusalem, who, in effect, would rule over territory that's roughly coterminous with the modern day state of Israel. And the king himself would have nobles under him, much like any kind of kingdom back in Western Europe. If anything, he would be a little stronger than some of the kings within Western Europe. This kingdom was supplied by some of the great Italian naval cities. And in fact, without their supplies that came from Western Europe, it would have been very difficult for this new kingdom to survive, because many of the people it surrounded it were openly hostile to its existence and not willing to supply it with many goods. One of the problems that this new Western European kingdom in the Middle East ran into immediately was that there were not enough men to do the fighting. Though if those people who had survived the crusade, in many cases, would simply return home to Western Europe. They had no desire to live in this new territory. The function of fighting would largely fall to people referred to as the Knights Templar. This was a group that had started with a relatively simple purpose. These were knights who were meant to be escorts for pilgrims to make sure that they could go on the road to visit various holy sites. But soon they would transform themselves into something very different. They were given a house near the main church in Jerusalem, which is the temple of their name, the Knights Templar. And at this time, they would establish themselves as a very new kind of creature, a military religious order, a group who, like monks, were meant to devote their lives to God, but the kind of service they offered was not prayer, was not copying manuscripts, but was fighting, was fighting against Muslims. And for this mission, the Knights Templar received all kind of vast lands and contributions, sometimes from people who supported the crusading effort, even though if they couldn't go fight themselves. And in fact, they ended up getting so much territory and money that the Knights Templar even actually got into banking in Western Europe as well as in this new kingdom. To support the crusading effort too, you will see temporary visitors who will come from Western Europe, and they will come and they will fight for a short period of time, and then if they survive, they will return back to Western Europe. In time, another major crusade would be preached throughout Western Europe. This one that would actually end up featuring two kings, both the King of France and of Germany. Unfortunately, this second crusade did not have enough men, and in effect, the Turks really had learned much better how to fight against Western Europeans. We also think that the eventual battle plan of the Crusaders, of the Western Europeans, proved to be fairly illogical. The Crusaders decided to attack this city here, known as Damascus, to create a siege in which they would surround it and eventually take it. And this was a very strange choice because Damascus, although ruled by Muslims, had actually been friendly, been allies of the Western Europeans up until this point. And this siege ended up being unsuccessful, and it ended up actually creating a new enemy for the Western Europeans. These crusades also had the effect of creating a new enemy for the Crusaders. And that is specifically in the form of a great new Muslim general known as Saladin, pictured here and also here. Saladin was a general who had actually come from an ethnic minority in the Muslim world. And we know that he, in addition to being a very good military mind, was known to have been very pious. And in fact, really to just play up his piety in the Muslim world to increase his popularity. Before he ended up fighting against Crusaders, we know that Saladin first fought against other Muslims and eventually became the master of Egypt, one of the great Muslim powers at the time. What Saladin managed to do was to once again, he raised the flag of holy war, of jihad in Islam. And in fact, he managed to rally together many of the Muslim forces and unify them because of the presence of a common enemy, because of the presence of Christians and this new Western European kingdom. And in fact, we know Saladin would end up leading a series of brilliant attacks against Christians, taking back nearly all of the cities that were once held by Western Europeans. What was interesting about these attacks, though, was although Saladin was very successful, we know that whenever possible, he tried to withhold violence from the people he fought against. And in fact, even when he took back the city of Jerusalem for Islam, he did not massacre the inhabitants. He allowed them to live. This kind of generosity to the defeated strangely led to popularity that people felt of Saladin, not only in the Muslim world, but actually in the Christian world. And in fact, some Christians even began to circulate some rumors that were obviously false, that Saladin himself at some point had decided to convert to Christianity because they couldn't imagine a Muslim general to have been so kindly disposed towards Christians if he were not a Christian himself. The successes that Saladin had would end up inspiring yet another crusade to attempt to reconquer the lands lost. Initially, this crusade managed to make some significant headway, but one of the major leaders who was foremost in this crusade among Western Europeans ended up dying of natural causes. And we think that eventually what this crusade settled on doing was taking back some of the main coastal cities that Christians had held but had lost to Saladin. And this is just one manuscript illumination of the English king who's attacking Saladin on horseback. And you can see Saladin, of course, here looks more like a smurf than a human being. In spite of several real successes, ultimately this crusade failed to retake the city of Jerusalem for Christians. And so for many in the Christian world, it was viewed as a failure. With that being said, this crusade had managed to at least halt Saladin's advance, and it would also allow Christians free access to the city of Jerusalem, so pilgrims could go there once again. The next major crusade, and the last one I'll discuss here, the crusade, sometimes known as the Fourth Crusade, ended up being a complete and utter disaster. And for some, it was a sign that the crusading movement as a whole had really lost its way. The Fourth Crusade initially had the Crusaders in this campaign were going to sail to Egypt, which was one of the major Muslim powers, and first attack that, and only then go and attack Jerusalem and other cities in the Middle East. There were two major participants in this crusade, the French and Venetians, the people who lived in Venice, again, one of these great naval powers of Italy. For reasons that are really difficult to understand, French crusaders ended up sitting down to negotiate with the Venetians. And the French promised the Venetians far more people, more fighters, and far more money than they could possibly deliver. And so when the French ended up coming to the city of Venice, because the Venetians were meant to both to ferry across the French to Egypt and to take part in the campaign with them. And when the French came to Venice without all the men they had promised and without the money they had promised, the Venetians said that, in effect, they had really reneged on their deal. And the only way that the French could make it up to the Venetians was if they took part in a series of side campaigns or campaigns before the major crusade. And just to show you how far the Venetians had deviated from what was thought to be the goals of the crusade, that is, to fight against Muslims, the first target of the Fourth Crusade was not a Muslim city at all. It was a Christian city, and one of the major commercial rivals that Venice had at the time. The second major target was the city of Constantinople, the great Christian city and the capital city of the Byzantine Empire. And due to a very complicated dispute involving who was the proper emperor of the Byzantine Empire, the Crusaders ended up taking one of the sides, and when the Crusaders were not paid what they were supposed to by the Byzantines, they ended up going and really giving over the city of Constantinople to pillaging and terrible pillaging, unrestrained pillaging for a series of around 3 days. And some of the pillaging involved sacred relics, which were then brought back to Western Europe. And at this point, for a period of time, a Western European count would end up actually taking over the title of emperor in Constantinople. And the Venetians, the French, and various other people from Western Europe would end up taking over pieces of what had once been the unified Byzantine Empire. And this would end up helping to contribute to the eventual disintegration of the Byzantine Empire. Now, while Christians now were spending more time fighting against other Christians, this gave really a breathing period for Muslims to reorganize themselves. And in particular, important in this process is a new group of powerful Muslims that would take over and end up, in fact, leading the Muslim world. These are people known as the Mamluks. The Mamluks, interestingly enough, had actually been both bodyguards and, in fact, slaves of the Turks. And in fact, they had actually had a rebellion against their masters and then ending up taking over, especially Egypt, for themselves. And the Mamluks were really known for their military prowess. To give you some idea of how scary they would be to meet on the battlefield, this is a fully armored Mamluk horse. We also know, too, that I should say that Mamluks, in addition to their reputation on the battlefield, were known to be patrons of art. They were known, too, like Saladin before them, to be observant Muslims and trying to unify Muslims by religion. And they also sponsored diplomacy and trade as well. For our interests here, though, what is important is that the Mamluks decided to, as one of their major goals, to finally bring an end to the crusading movement in the Middle East. And in effect, they were finally successful in the task that other Muslim leaders had set before themselves. They drove out all Christians from the Middle East and ended this experiment, this kingdom. The Mamluks, however, were important in another way too. And to be able to discuss these battles, we have to recall our earlier discussions about Imperial China and the invasions of the Mongols. And as we had said previously, the Mongols had now absorbed this enormous land empire. And although we didn't discuss it as much before, the Mongols also became an enormous threat, not only to China, not only to places in Eastern Europe, but also into the Muslim world as well. And in effect, they would also, for a period of time, also take over most of the Middle East themselves. And this not only breaks the domination of Turkish forces in the Middle East, it also means that the Mongols would bring an end, for instance, to the splinter group, the Assassins. The Mongols would end up wiping them all out. And in effect, we think that Mongols saw as their major goal world domination. So it really didn't matter who the adversary was. For a short period of time, we think that when Christians learned of the attacks of the Mongols against the Muslim world, there was hope that the Mongols could be converted to Christianity, and that they could actually become a major ally of the Christian forces. And so hopefully together they reasoned they could join together with the Mongols, the Christians, the Mongols, and then wipe out the Muslim domination. This never really happened, and in addition to the fact that Mongols would never convert en masse to Christianity, we also see that the Mongols had a huge amount of trouble managing to dominate the Muslim world. In fact, they never did a very thorough job of it. And we see that the Mamluks, seizing upon some of the weakness that they saw in the Mongols, the Mamluks would actually manage to field an impressive army against the Mongols. And they actually ended up beating the Mongols on the battlefield and actually killed a Mongol general in the course of battle. And this, in addition to just weakening their already shaky hold on the Middle East, we think that this sent out the message to the world that the Mongols were not invincible. And this is what really begins to turn the tide for the Mongols and bring an end to their famous age of conquest. And this is why, in fact, that in many cases, Mongols simply would end up pulling out of the Muslim world entirely. Many of them chose to move to Eastern Europe, where they had much better grazing territories for their horses, and where they found it was simply much easier to control the populace. We don't think the Mongol leaders ever really managed to connect very well with their subjects. And those who chose to stay in the Middle East would end up converting to Islam, so never to Christianity at all. For those of you who do like large, destructive empires, however, even as the Mongol Empire ends up fading away, there was one last flash of terror in the West when a new conqueror rose up, a man known as Timur the Lame. And Timur the Lame, some indication in this in this illumination, he actually had a lame foot, which is why he got that name. Genetically speaking, we think that Timur was well disposed to being a good warrior. His ancestry was a combination of being Turks and Mongols, and although his army was largely made up of disaffected Turks. In the late 14th century, Timur, also shown here, would end up going on a series of remarkably fierce and deadly attacks that would, you can see here, the full extent of their empire, which was enormous. We think that Timur really drove people in battle very well, but it is perhaps even more so than other leaders that we've seen in the past, like, for instance, Alexander the Great. Timur had absolutely no vision beyond destruction. And destruction, I should say, by the way, of anyone who got in his path. In some ways, Timur was an equal opportunity killer. It didn't really matter to him what religion you were, as if you were standing in his way, he was happy to destroy you. We don't think Timur ends up having much of a legacy, if only because it wasn't really much of a cultural legacy at all, and we don't think this empire that he brought together by conquest really lasts all that long. And we see that his successors only hold on to his conquests for a short period of time, and then this huge empire would end up breaking apart very quickly. When finally the Mongols were no longer a threat to the Muslim world, when finally Timur and his successors would end up passing away, then all of a sudden, the Muslim powers at the time could begin to turn back to the same target that we had discussed that they had once attempted to conquer centuries ago. That is the Byzantine Empire. After the Byzantines had gotten into these series of conflicts with Western Europeans, for approximately 2 centuries afterwards, they would fight a losing battle for survival. They fought in part with their powerful Muslim neighbors, but also, to some degree, to simply drive out some of those Western Europeans who had been ruling their territory. By the time we get to the 14th century, the Byzantines felt a deepening sense of isolation. They really, in some sense, felt totally abandoned to Muslim foes. And especially, in particular, one group of Turks, known as the Ottoman Turks, slowly absorbed their lands, which would eventually be, especially be the modern-day state of Turkey. And in fact, the Ottoman Turks very successfully managed to surround the capital city of Constantinople on all sides. The Byzantines, during this period of time, made a desperate attempt to find anyone they could from Western Europe. This is just an image of one Byzantine emperor who ended up traveling to Western Europe to beg for aid. And they were happy to take crusaders, Western mercenaries, and in some cases, the Byzantines who traveled to Western Europe to ask for help at this point were even ready to make concessions on the religious front. They, for instance, were willing to accept the primacy of the Pope and all of the theological positions of the West that had been so controversial. And I should say that many Byzantines were dead set against these agreements that their leaders had made, even in the face of disaster. In fact, they were willing to lose to the Ottoman Turks rather than accept some of these theological positions. Perhaps because by this period, we think that the crusading movement no longer held the same sort of grip over people's imagination in Western Europe. We do see some Western Europeans come to help the Byzantines, but there could be no common cause among Western Europeans, and certainly not enough people to be able to really ultimately affect their fate. So after having taken virtually all other Byzantine land, the last place that the Ottoman Turks decided to take was the capital city of Constantinople itself, a city that they had hoped to use then as their capital city. And at this point, there would be a struggle for the 1,000-year-old capital city. The leader among the Ottoman Turks who finally managed to take the city of Constantinople for Islam was the man pictured here, Mehmet II, who afterwards was known as Mehmet the Conqueror. And he would take the city in the year 1453. That, in fact, for many previous generations of historians, used to be known as the date in which the Middle Ages came to an end because of the fall of the city, which really was the last rump of the Roman Empire. And in effect, really would end up causing a lot of fear throughout Western Europe that if the Ottoman Turks could end up taking the city of Constantinople, then surely they could make all sorts of incursions into Western Europe as well. It is fair to say that Mehmet II persisted despite all the obstacles. It was quite difficult, even at the time, to take the city of Constantinople. And we are told, too, that he ruthlessly drove his Turks onto the walls, even after many would die. And he would also assemble a large navy to also assist these efforts to take the city. It is said that as he watched the unfolding of the battle, Mehmet II often admired the courage of some Byzantine soldiers. And in fact, if he really felt that a soldier had fought well enough, even on the enemy side, he would allow him to live, supposedly. The one thing that really worked in Mehmet II's favor was that at this period, the age of gunpowder was upon us. And we know that Mehmet ended up having built for himself an enormous cannon, a series of enormous cannons like this one, by a Hungarian engineer. Now, it is fair to say that gunpowder was only so useful in battle, at least especially in the form of these cannons, because it was said that it would take as many as 1,000 oxen to actually move one of these things. And due to the long, cumbersome process of cleaning them, you could actually only fire them 7 times in a day. So the only thing, in fact, that these cannons were really good for was attacking a walled city. But that was exactly what Constantinople was at the time. And we think that these cannons led to such huge holes in the defensive walls of the city of Constantinople, and ones that developed so quickly that they really could not be repaired in time. And in fact, that was what allowed Mehmet II to be able to get so many of his soldiers to enter the city. When things truly finally became desperate, supposedly a final Christian mass was held in the major church of the city. You'll remember the Hagia Sophia. And in fact, a legend came that midway through the mass, it was already the battle in the streets was in desperate straits, and the priest who was holding it decided to have a procession, and he ended up being enveloped by one of the walls of the church, the Hagia Sophia. And supposedly the procession would only come out and the mass would only continue once the city of Constantinople was once again Christian. So because that's never happened, the mass has never actually continued. The final emperor of the Byzantine Empire, who actually, although you don't need to know this for this class, actually had the fateful name of Constantine, in this case Constantine XI, would end up apparently die fighting in the streets against the Ottoman Turks, thus extinguishing the line of Byzantine emperors. At that point, the church, the Hagia Sophia, would end up actually being turned into a mosque. We think, too, at this point, the Ottoman Turks who took over the city for understandable reasons, because they felt in many cases Western Europeans had tried to help the Byzantines to save their empire. They ended up turning against some of those merchants, like the Venetians, and in effect cast them out of their empire. If there's anything good that came of the fall of Constantinople from the perspective of Western Europe, was that some scholars, some Byzantine scholars, people who, for instance, studied the ancient Greek world, would, when they recognized that the end was near, they would end up taking great ancient Greek manuscripts like this one and going into Italy. And in fact, they would help to both inspire and to further the goals of the Renaissance. In particular, the love of the Renaissance for ancient Greek learning and Greek learning as a whole. The second major consequence of the fall of the Byzantine Empire, and again, this kind of this lack of a desire to have Western Europeans within it, meant that no longer could Western European merchants, come to the city of Constantinople. Eventually, would be named the city of Istanbul, to be able to get some of the great luxury items that we've discussed that came from further in the east. So think of, for instance, spices, or think of silk. As a result, then, of this conquest, many Western European merchants who still had a desire to get these items would start to think to themselves, if they couldn't get them any longer in this new empire of the Ottoman Turks, where could they get them? And it began to make people think more seriously about going, instead of going to the east to find these items, perhaps going to the west to eventually hit places like China and India, around this sort of new sort of Muslim barrier that had been created. Thank you. That's lecture for Muslim conflict. I will see you in class.